Imagine your uncle walks into a private jet showroom with a check for $6 million. He looks at the aircraft, looks at the salesman, and thinks the hardest part is over. He can afford the plane, he can afford the purchase, he can finally live like the people he's been watching on Instagram. But 6 months later, he realizes something nobody told him. Buying the jet wasn't the expensive part. Keeping it was, and that raises a much more interesting question. How rich do you actually need to be before owning a private jet stops being a financial mistake? Because if you have $5 million, $10 million, or even $20 million sitting somewhere in your net worth, you might think you're rich enough. But a private jet doesn't just consume money when it flies. It consumes money while it sits on the ground, and that changes everything. Think about the way most people buy expensive things. You save for the house, you calculate the mortgage. You look at the monthly payment, you buy the car, you calculate the loan. But a private jet doesn't work like a normal luxury purchase. There are pilots, insurance, hangar space, maintenance, fuel training, management. And then there is the cost you don't see until later. Depreciation. The National Business Aviation Association explains that aircraft ownership involves both fixed ownership costs and direct operating costs, and that full ownership generally makes more sense when the aircraft is being used heavily. One NBAA rule of thumb puts meaningful utilization around 250 flight hours a year, although the right number depends on the aircraft and the owner's situation. So here's the first uncomfortable truth. You don't become financially ready for a private jet simply when you can afford to buy one. You become financially ready when you can afford the entire ecosystem surrounding it. And that's a very different number. Now picture another person. Let's call him Mark. Mark is a successful business owner. His company is worth $40 million. He personally has several million dollars in investments, real estate, and business interests. One day he gets tired of commercial airports. The security lines, the delays, the connections, the hours sitting at an airport, just to spend another few hours in the air. So he starts looking at private jets. The first jet he sees costs around $5 million. It suddenly feels possible, but then his advisor asks him one question. How many hours are you actually going to fly? Mark says maybe 80, and that's when the conversation changes. Because if you're only flying a relatively small number of hours each year, owning the entire aircraft may not be the smartest way to buy private aviation. You could charter, you could use a jet card. You could consider fractional ownership. The NBAA recognizes all of these as different ownership and operating structures, each suited to different travel patterns. And suddenly, Mark isn't asking, can I afford a jet? He's asking, am I wealthy enough to own one inefficiently? That is a much harder question, because the rich don't necessarily buy the most expensive thing they can afford. They often care about whether the thing makes financial sense relative to everything else they could do with the money. And that's where the private jet story gets much deeper, because the real cost isn't sitting on the price tag, it's hiding underneath it. And once you see those costs, you may completely change the number you thought you needed. Let's start with the number everyone notices first: the purchase price. Depending on the aircraft, private jets can cost several $million and climb dramatically higher for larger, newer aircraft. But let's say you find a jet for $5 million. You have $10 million in total net worth. Technically, you could buy it, but should you? That's where wealth and affordability become two completely different concepts. If you spent half of your net worth on one aircraft, you haven't simply bought transportation. You've concentrated an enormous amount of your wealth into a depreciating asset that also requires continuous cash flow. And that's the part people underestimate. The jet doesn't care whether the stock market had a bad year. The pilots still need to be paid. The insurance bill still arrives. The aircraft still needs maintenance. The hangar still needs to be paid. And fuel doesn't become free because you had a bad quarter. NetJets, for example, breaks private aviation costs into categories including management fees, occupied hourly fees, fuel, maintenance, insurance, crew-related expenses, and hangar-related costs. Its current U.S. programs start at $215,000 for a jet card, while fractional ownership involves a separate ownership investment and ongoing fees. That's not the cost of owning an entire aircraft. It's something much more important. It's a reminder that private aviation is an ongoing financial system, not a one-time purchase. Now imagine your father. He's worked for decades. He finally sells his company for $15 million. For the first time in his life, he feels genuinely wealthy. His friends tell him, "You've made it." And he starts looking at the things wealthy people buy. A waterfront house, a luxury car, a private jet. The house makes sense to him. The car makes sense. But the jet creates a strange psychological effect. It doesn't just say, "I can afford this." It says, "I've made it." And that emotional feeling can be incredibly expensive, because luxury purchases can sometimes become identity purchases. You're no longer buying the object, you're buying what the object represents: success, freedom, status, privacy. The feeling that you've finally escaped ordinary life, and that's exactly when wealthy people can make ordinary financial mistakes. Not because they're bad with money, but because money starts becoming psychological. Your grandfather may have spent his entire life saving every dollar. Your father may have built a business. You may have made millions through technology, investing, or entrepreneurship. And suddenly the question becomes, what is the point of having money if I can't enjoy it? That's a fair question. But there is another question wealthy people have to ask. How much wealth can I safely convert into lifestyle? Because every dollar spent on lifestyle is a dollar that can no longer compound. That's the hidden opportunity cost. Suppose someone has $20 million invested and decides to put $6 million into an aircraft. The question isn't simply whether they still have $14 million. The question is what the $6 million might have become if it had remained invested. That's where the private jet becomes more than a luxury purchase. It becomes a wealth allocation decision. And this is where the answer to our original question starts getting surprising. Because there may not be one magic net worth number. Instead, there is a point where the purchase price becomes almost irrelevant compared with the annual cash flow required to support the lifestyle. And that's when the real question changes again. How much income and liquid wealth do you need to make the jet feel financially boring? Because that's the level of wealth where luxury stops threatening your financial security. And most people dramatically underestimate how far away that level can be. Think about the difference between being able to buy something and being able to forget that you own it. That's the real definition of financial comfort. If you buy a $5 million jet and spend the next 5 years worrying about maintenance bills, utilization, resale value, insurance, and whether you're flying enough to justify it, you're not really financially free. You simply own an expensive responsibility. The National Business Aviation Association notes that full ownership generally requires substantial utilization to make economic sense, while fractional ownership and charter can make more sense depending on how often someone flies. And that's why the wealthiest person in the room isn't always the person with the biggest jet. Sometimes it's the person who realizes they don't need to own one. Maybe they fly 40 hours a year. For them, chartering can provide the experience without putting millions of dollars into an aircraft. Maybe they fly 100 hours. Fractional ownership or a jet program might make more sense. Maybe they're constantly flying between offices, countries, and business operations. Now, full ownership starts becoming a different conversation. The key isn't the word rich, it's utilization, it's liquidity, it's income, it's net worth, and it's how much of your financial life depends on the asset. So if you ask me, how rich do you need to be to own a private jet? I wouldn't give you a single number, but I'd give you a principle. You should be wealthy enough that buying the aircraft doesn't change your long-term financial plan, and wealthy enough that the annual operating costs don't force you to sell investments, take unnecessary business risks, or change your lifestyle every time the economy turns against you. Because that's the difference between looking rich and being financially secure. Imagine your uncle again. He owns the jet. He walks onto the runway. The engines start. He takes off over the city. From the outside, it looks like the ultimate symbol of wealth. But the real luxury isn't the jet. The real luxury is being able to own that jet without it controlling your finances. That's a completely different level of wealth, and maybe that's the lesson most people miss when they look at private jets. They see the aircraft, they don't see the balance sheet behind it, they see the leather seats. They don't see the pilots, they see the freedom. They don't see the maintenance schedule, they see the $5 million purchase price. They don't see the years of operating costs, and they see someone who looks rich. But wealth isn't really about how expensive your lifestyle looks from the runway. It's about how little that lifestyle threatens your future. That's why someone with $10 million might technically be able to buy a private jet, while someone with $50 million or $100 million may be in a completely different position to own one comfortably. Not because there's a legal minimum net worth, there isn't. It's because financial safety depends on what percentage of your wealth you're putting at risk, how much cash flow you generate, how frequently you use the aircraft, and what alternatives could provide the same benefit. And there's one final thing worth remembering. If you ever become wealthy enough to ask yourself whether you should buy a private jet, don't ask only, "Can I afford the plane?" Ask, "Can I afford everything that comes after the plane?" Because that question separates a luxury purchase from a sustainable luxury lifestyle. And perhaps that's what real wealth looks like. Not being able to buy almost anything, but being able to buy something extraordinary without it changing the future you're trying to build. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to MSBT Finance for more stories about money, wealth, and the financial decisions shaping America's future.